What would you do if you woke up one morning and discovered that the very thing you had spent your whole life building was gone? Today, I want to share the story of a man whose greatest tragedy became the greatest evidence of God's faithfulness. And by the end of this story, you may never look at your own pain the same way again. On a quiet stretch of the American coastline, far away from crowded cities and busy highways, stood a small wooden cottage overlooking the sea. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't impressive. But to the man who lived there, it was everything. His name was Thomas. Thomas wasn't wealthy. He made a simple living with his own hands. Every day he crafted beautiful wooden keepsakes, small boats, handcrafted furniture, and decorative pieces that travelers and passing merchants often bought before continuing their journey along the coast. His workshop wasn't separate from his home. It was part of it. Every tool he owned, every project he had spent weeks creating, every memory he cherished was inside that little house by the sea. To most people, it looked ordinary. To Thomas, it was a gift from God. Every morning before the sun rose above the horizon, he would step outside onto the weathered wooden porch. The cool ocean breeze would brush across his face. The waves rolled gently against the shore. Seagulls circled overhead. Thomas would close his eyes, fold his hands, and quietly pray. Lord, thank you for another day. Thank you for this home. Thank you for the work you've placed in my hands. Everything I have belongs to you. And no matter what today brings, help me trust you a little more than I did yesterday. The people in the nearby village admired Thomas, but they never understood him. Sometimes they would laugh and say, "Thomas, you thank God like a rich man, even though you live in a little house by the sea." Thomas would simply smile. Then he'd answer, "When you realize everything you have is a gift, you stop measuring your life by how much you own." He truly believed that God never made mistakes. He had no idea that before the next sunrise, his faith would face the greatest test of his life. That day had begun like every other. Thomas spent the morning sanding pieces of oak and cedar in his little workshop. The rhythmic sound of his tools mixed with the gentle crashing of the waves outside. By afternoon, he had finished carving 2 small wooden sailboats for a family who would be arriving the following week. On the workbench rested a beautiful handcrafted rocking chair, the finest piece he had ever built. He smiled as he gently ran his hand across the smooth, polished wood. "One more day," he whispered. "Just one more day, Lord, and it'll be finished." As evening settled over the coastline, the peaceful blue sky slowly disappeared. Dark clouds gathered over the ocean. The wind, once gentle, began to howl. The seagulls that usually circled above the shore vanished. Even the sea seemed restless. The old fishermen in the village looked toward the horizon with worried faces. One of them quietly muttered, "This storm isn't going to be like the others." Thomas hurried home. He secured the windows, locked the doors, brought in the last of his tools from outside. Then, as he always did before going to bed, he knelt beside his chair, folded his hands, and prayed. "Lord, if tonight brings trouble, don't let fear be stronger than my faith. Stay with me, whatever happens." Moments later, a deafening crack of thunder split the sky. The entire cottage shook. Rain slammed against the windows. The wind screamed through every crack in the walls. The calm sea Thomas had loved for years had become violent. Towering waves crashed against the shoreline with terrifying force. Thomas grabbed his lantern and opened the front door. The sight before him stole his breath. The ocean was pushing farther inland with every wave. The wind was so fierce, it was almost impossible to stand. He rushed back inside, trying to gather a few important things. His Bible, his tools, the wooden sailboats he had spent days carving. Then, suddenly, a powerful gust of wind burst through one of the windows. Glass shattered across the floor. The lantern slipped from Thomas's hand. It crashed onto the old wooden floor. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a single flame appeared. Within moments, the dry timber erupted into fire. No! Thomas grabbed a bucket of water and threw it toward the flames. But the wind only made the fire stronger. The flames climbed the walls. The ceiling caught fire. Smoke filled every room. Outside, neighbors came running through the rain. One of them grabbed Thomas by the arm. "Thomas, get out! The whole place is burning!" Thomas struggled to pull away. "Please, let me go. Everything I own is in there. My home, my workshop, my whole life is inside that house." But the flames had already taken over. There was nothing anyone could do. The villagers held him back as he stood helplessly in the pouring rain, watching everything he had spent years building disappear before his eyes. The fire burned higher and higher, sending thick black smoke deep into the night sky. Thomas couldn't know it then, but that column of smoke, the one that looked like the end of his life, had already become a signal, seen by someone far beyond the darkness. The storm finally passed before dawn. By sunrise, the sky was clear again. The same ocean that had raged with terrifying power just a few hours earlier now looked calm and peaceful. But Thomas's heart was anything but peaceful. He slowly walked through the ashes, searching for anything that might have survived. A burned hammer, a cracked coffee mug, pieces of blackened wood that had once been the walls of his home. Everything else was gone. He knelt down, picked up a small piece of charred wood, and held it tightly in his trembling hands. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then he looked toward heaven, his eyes filled with tears. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Lord, I've thanked you every single day. You've always been the one I trusted. Then why? Why did you let my home burn?" He swallowed hard. "I don't understand. If this is part of your plan, please help me see what I can't see." There was no answer, only the gentle sound of the waves rolling onto the shore. Thomas lowered his head. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to pray. Just then, a deep ship's horn echoed across the water. "Oh!" Thomas slowly lifted his head. Far out at sea, a large cargo ship was approaching the shoreline. A few minutes later, the ship dropped anchor offshore. a small rescue boat was lowered into the water. 3 sailors rowed toward the beach. Standing at the front of the boat was the ship's captain. The moment they reached the shore, the captain hurried toward Thomas. Relief washed over his face. "Thank God," he said. "We finally found you." Thomas looked confused. "Found me?" The captain nodded. "Last night was one of the worst storms we've ever sailed through. We completely lost our bearings. The rain was so heavy we couldn't see the shoreline. The waves kept pushing us farther off course." He paused, looking at the burned remains of the cottage. Then he quietly said, "Just when we thought we were completely lost, we saw a huge column of smoke rising into the sky. It was the only thing visible through the storm. We knew someone had to be in trouble, so we changed our course and followed the smoke." Thomas stood frozen. The captain continued, "If that fire hadn't happened, we never would have found this coastline." And honestly, he looked Thomas in the eyes. "We probably never would have found you." Silence filled the air. Thomas slowly turned and looked at the ashes of his little home. Only a few moments earlier, he had seen nothing but loss. Now, for the very first time, he saw something completely different. The fire he had called a tragedy had become the very signal that led help straight to him. Tears rolled down his face, not because the pain was gone, but because at last he understood. Sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers the way we expect. Sometimes his answer is hidden inside the very thing that breaks our heart. Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the ashes of the little home he had loved so deeply. Nothing around him had changed. His house was still gone. His workshop was still gone. His tools, his furniture, his unfinished projects had all been reduced to ashes. But something inside him had changed forever. Slowly, he fell to his knees. This time, he wasn't asking God why. He simply folded his hands, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Lord, last night I asked you why you let my home burn. Today, I realize you never stopped watching over me. I thought you were taking everything away, but all along, you were leading help straight to me." A tear rolled down his face, not a tear of despair, but a tear of gratitude. That day, Thomas lost a house, but he found something far more valuable, a faith that no storm could ever destroy. Maybe this story isn't really about Thomas. Maybe it's about every one of us. Perhaps your house didn't burn, but maybe something else did. A relationship, a dream, a business you worked years to build, a job you never expected to lose, a prayer that still hasn't been answered. And just like Thomas, maybe you've looked toward heaven and whispered, "Lord, why?" The hardest part about trusting God is that we only see today, but God sees the entire journey. We see the ashes, He sees the rescue. We see the closed door, He sees the danger behind it. We see the loss, He sees the life He is protecting. Sometimes God doesn't remove the storm. Sometimes He uses the storm to guide us toward the place we were always meant to be.